you can look at the brain from front to back, and you can divide it roughly into two sections, and one section has to do with sensory processing, and that's roughly the back half, and one section has to do with motor output. Now those things aren't as clearly differentiated as you might think, because there's very little sensation without motor output. Maybe the part that closest to an exception is smell, I would say, but you at least have to breathe in, you know, and when an animal is actively searching out a scent trail, it's breathing in, so it's using its motor output constantly to modify the sensory stream. It's really difficult to dissociate the two, and when you're looking at something, you know, it kind of feels to you like you're a passive recipient of sense data, but you're no such thing. Your eyes are moving back and forth in multiple ways all the time, including the ways that you can control voluntarily. So there's multiple involuntary systems that are moving your eyes in multiple ways, and really what you're doing is feeling the array of the electromagnetic spectrum with your eyes. You're feeling it, and you're actively exploring it. You're not a passive recipient at all. So even in sensation, you can't purely pull sensation out from motor processing and say I'm getting untrammeled, unbiased sense data, because you can't look at something without focusing, and you can't focus without wanting to look at something. You know, you can't just lie there with your, well, you could with your eyes half crossed, but you know, that's sort of like, imagine you dropped a video recorder from an airplane and it just spun around in an unfocused manner. Well, that's the world sampled randomly. You know, what are you going to do with that? Nothing. Okay, so anyways, back to the brain. Sensory unit, that's the back half, roughly speaking. Huge chunk of that is devoted to visual processing in human beings, right? Most animals organized around smell, not us. Somewhat still, because smell is a very powerful evoker of memories, and it has a direct relationship with emotional systems, because you need to know if something is edible or inedible, terrible or good, very, very rapidly. But human beings are organized around vision, so we have a massive amounts of our cortex devoted to differentiated visual processing. Now the motor unit, so what you have is each of these little zones here. So for example, look at the back here, that's the primary visual area and the secondary visual area, and then this is the primary auditory area in the middle of the brain here on the outside, and the secondary auditory area, and then this is for body representation, the primary area and the secondary area. And you can think about those areas of primary, secondary, and then tertiary. Primary does the base level processing. Tertiary expands that up into more abstract representation, or secondary expands that up into more abstract representations, and tertiary are the areas where the senses come together. And then the motor unit, you have the primary unit, the secondary unit, and the premotor, or the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is particularly huge in human beings. So imagine that it's this primary and secondary areas that allow you to first of all to act voluntarily, and then to play around in some sense with your actions. You know, like imagine that you're a child building with Legos, and you can think with the Legos without really having to think abstractly, right? Because you can play around and build different sorts of structures, and so you can think at a level of motor output without having to depend on abstraction. But if you develop the prefrontal cortex here, which emerged out of the motor and premotor areas over the course of evolution, so it's a differentiation of those structures. So this is dealing with the real world. This is dealing mostly with the real world, but starting to abstract and experiment a little bit. And then this part deals with abstractions, pure and simple. Roughly speaking, in right-handed males, and the reason that I'm concentrating on right-handed males is because they're simpler in their neurological structure. Women have a more complicated neurological structure, and left-handed people tend to have a more complicated neurological structure. So we'll just say that we'll just go with the standard model to begin with, and you can assume that the same systems are there in every person, but they're not laid out on the hemispheric structure quite as neatly, but they're still there. So it's sort of like these are tendencies. So for example, if you're so there's a tendency for the right hemisphere to specialize for what's relatively unknown, and the left hemisphere to specialize for what's relatively mastered. So large-scale, low-resolution abstractions tend to be the province of the right. High-resolution, detailed knowledge structures tend to be the province of the left. The left is linguistic. That's where the detailed structures manifest themselves in articulation. But the fundamental difference between the left and right isn't language versus non-language. The fundamental distinction is relatively explored and mastered versus relatively unexplored and not mastered. And that's both in terms of structure. The right hemisphere has a less granular structure. It's less differentiated. It's also responsible mostly for negative emotion, especially in the prefrontal part. And the reason for that is, well, how do you encounter what's absolutely unknown? Imagination and emotion, right? I told you that little experiment that you could do if you're alone in a house and you hear a strange noise at night in a room. Just turn off the lights and put your hand in the room. It's like your brain will just flash off monsters like mad. You know, you'll be nervous because what's in that room? Something to make you nervous. That's a very low resolution category, right? The right hemisphere responds rapidly to what's unknown, and that's subcorticals. The hippocampus is doing an awful lot of that, noting a mismatch. And then it's using the right hemisphere to abstractly represent what the possibility space is in relationship to unexpected things. And then the right hemisphere is tracking that continually, what those unexpected things are, and coming up with models of what you haven't yet mastered. And that's kept separate from the left hemisphere, which already has functional models. And you don't want to blast the left hemisphere continually with anomalous information because you blow out its structure and then you don't know what to do. So the right hemisphere generates new models in some sense out of nothing, and then when the time is right, taps information into the left hemisphere slowly so that it doesn't disrupt its function too much. And a lot of that seems to happen when you're dreaming, by the way. It happens at night.